Can you please do it?
Yes, thank you. Commissioners, staff, and meeting participants, thank you for joining us this evening for the December 8th, 2021 Monte Sereno Site and Architectural Commission meeting. Before the meeting is called to order, I'd like to point out a few things to assist commission members, staff, and members of the public to successfully participate in this meeting. Commissioners, please keep your microphones muted until you wish to speak. For this commission meeting, we are using Zoom to host the meeting. At the bottom of the Zoom client, there are two icons, chat and raise hand. Please use chat only to report technical issues, such as being unable to hear a commissioner speaking. Please use the raise hand if you would like to be recognized and enabled to speak by the commission to the commission by the chairperson. Comments in the chat feature will not be part of the public record. For the public to comment under oral communication or on any agenda item, in addition to using the raise hand feature, emails can be submitted to the city planner, limited to 350 words, and they will be read into the record. This limit is set to adhere to the typical 3-minute allowance. Only attendees using the Zoom application can use the raise hand option to comment. Participation from a telephone will allow for listening only and does not allow for any feedback. And finally, because we are not all in the same room, all votes at this meeting will be taken by roll call.
Great, thank you very much. And let's do a roll call real quick for who's in attendance.
Commissioner Booker,
Present.
Commissioner Harrington,
Here.
Commissioner Sharma,
Here.
Commissioner Zeidler,
Here.
and Chair White.
Here, thank you very much, Ms. Briggins. Do we have any oral communications that are new to us today?
From me, I have not received
Okay.
oral or written communications that were not included on the agenda.
All right, and for this special meeting, do we need to engage in the community with an opportunity to speak about items that are not agendized tonight?
Yes, we do.
No, you do not.
Oh, we don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. And thank you for being here. Do we also have any written communications that hasn't been shared with the commission?
No, the only written communication we received for the first item on the public hearing was posted on the agenda.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Perkins. All right, so we're going to get started with our very first item, on the agenda tonight, which is a recommendation of both an urgency ordinance and a regular ordinance to the City Council related to implementation of SB 9. It's my understanding that both of the statutes are identical with the exception of their nature, one being urgent and the other being ordinary. Ms. Perkins, do you want to introduce additional information in relationship to that item?
Yes, thank you. Senate Bill 9 was signed into law by Governor Newsom on September 16th, 2021, and will be effective on January 1st, 2022. The most significant component of this bill is that it requires ministerial approval for up to 2 housing units per lot on any existing lot, and also ministerial approval of a one-time 2-lot subdivision of any single-family zoned lot meeting specific requirements in the statute. The written staff report includes details of the development activities allowed by the state legislation, a list of the properties where this legislation is not applicable, and limitations that are placed on the city by the SB 9 legislation. Although the new law supersedes varying local regulations regarding subdivision and development standards, SB 9 preserves some authority for local agencies to enact regulations through the adoption of new objective standards. Staff has provided several options of items that could be included in a local ordinance to the Site and Architectural Commissioners and council members at a joint study session on November 29th. These included clarifications of setbacks, limitation on building height in certain locations, options for allowable building size, parcel configuration, and parcel frontage. The feedback and direction provided at the November 29th joint study session are noted in the staff report prepared for tonight's meeting and, where possible, included in the recommended draft ordinances. Staff recommends that the Site and Architectural Commission recommend to the City Council adoption of the urgency ordinance, as well as the regular ordinance to implement the SB9 regulations. This concludes the staff report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Perkins. Commissioners, any questions for Ms. Perkins before we engage in this item?
I have a question. I don't know if this is appropriate time, but just they've asked for, the city council has asked for a recommendation on the urgency ordinance and the regular ordinance. Does our code allow us to perhaps adopt the urgency ordinance, but delay the permanent ordinance?
So the adoption of ordinances by the city is a matter regulated by state law. In order to adopt an urgency ordinance, it has to be in response to an urgent need in order to protect public health and safety. And it has to include a statement of the urgency. The council has to make specific findings, and it has to be approved by 4/5 vote. If the city does that, it goes into effect immediately. Now, with respect to your regular ordinance process, it has to go through 2 readings, and it can only go in effect 30 days after the passage on the 2nd reading. So the real purpose in terms of doing 2 ordinances in this matter is in case one, the council doesn't approve the urgency ordinance by 4/5 vote, we're at least on track for having approval by 3/5 vote. Alternatively, if somebody decides to challenge the urgency findings of the urgency ordinance, the intent would be that the regular ordinance would be passed before any lawsuit was actually commenced, making the lawsuit moot. So it's a belt and suspenders approach to making legislation.
That's interesting. The reason I'm asking, I saw another jurisdiction passed an urgency ordinance that was in effect for 45 days that could be extended up to almost 2 years. And then they were going to take time to review and make sure basically they'd gotten it right and take further community comment and see if basically they need to change anything before adopting the permanent ordinance.
So the state planning and zoning law allows a city to adopt a moratorium, which is in effect for 45 days while it conducts further study. And typically that moratorium can be extended. Now, I don't recommend that the city in this instance adopt a moratorium on SB9 applications, mostly because I don't think that it can. I think SB9 goes into effect January 1st. I don't necessarily think that the state planning and zoning law provisions allowing for moratoria were intended to or would necessarily, supplement SB9, which is a more specific law. So my recommendation would be, to the extent the city wants to adopt standards, that it do so by urgency ordinance, that it has something in place by January 1st. And then, additionally, the regular ordinance process, given that it does take longer, that there is the opportunity for a 2nd reading, the council could, in theory, take their time and make amendments and consider that further on a separate track.
Thank you.
Any other questions, commissioners, for Mr. Rudin or Ms. Perkins?
So I have one question. So if you have questions on the actual changes, is this the right time to ask, or should we ask that later?
I think it's up to us. I think Ms. Perkins is going to be, and Mr. Rudin are both going to be available to us after we hear public comment.
Okay.
And maybe we ought to do that first and then close public comment and then circle back and have some additional questions answered.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Dialogue. Is that all right with you, Mr. Rudin? Is that acceptable?
That's fine.
Okay. All right. With that, let's open this up to public comment. So for those of us attending tonight, thank you for doing so. This is your opportunity to talk about the proposed statutes that we are being asked tonight to recommend the city council adopt. And as you heard, on an emergency basis and then on a regular basis, the reasons why we're doing that. So if you'll use the raise hand feature, I'll know to call on you and you'll have an opportunity to talk about the proposed legislation that is going to be recommended to or not recommended to the city council tonight. And I see Mr. Jeans' hand up. Let me say, Tony, I'm going to call on you and give you an opportunity. But before you speak, I want to disclose something about communications with Mr. Jeans. Mr. Jeans was kind enough to prepare some written materials, which are in our staff or our packet tonight. And he also reached out to, I think, every commissioner in an email to see if we had an opportunity to meet with him. And both Commissioner Heather Harrington and I did today to better understand what he was trying to convey in the written materials that he prepared. We spoke with Mr. Jeans for 30, 45 minutes, something around that range, and got a better explanation than what the written materials provide in relationship to his concerns about approving or capping the size of proposed improvements on lot splits and lots which will have two structures built on them at 8,000, and what blight from his perspective that might create in our community. Anything else, Heather, that I skipped in our conversation?
No, I think you did a good job. Just to reiterate that we just listened to Mr. Jeans and did not give any opinion.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that we all couldn't engage in the same discussion, and I know his time is going to be limited today. But anyway, I wanted to share that with everybody as an introduction to Mr. Jeans, and I'm sorry to make you wait so long, Mr. Jeans, for that, but it will give you your time now.
Would it be possible for me to share a screen?
I don't have any objection to that, but I don't have any capability for doing that either.
Yes, if you could just give us a moment, we can set that up.
Okay, can you see that screen?
We can. Thank you, Tony.
Okay, so this, for those who haven't seen it, this is in your packet, and I'm going to try and skip through it as quickly as I can and still make it meaningful. It's a table that I put together after the study session. On the left-hand column, you see different options: a vacant lot, a lot with a house on it, a lot with a house and an ADU, et cetera, et cetera. What is allowed now? You'll see a total of 3 housing units are available on any lot in Monte Sereno. After SB 9, this will become a total of 4 because an additional housing unit is allowed to be built. Furthermore, on a lot in Monte Sereno that's appropriate, you could split it in 2. So there would be 2 lots. They would be smaller than your existing lot. And you can build only 2 units on each lot so that you would have, again, a total of 4, 2 on one parcel and 2 on another. That is what SB 9 is all about. So if I go to the next one, this is what I believe the council is suggesting we allow. If anyone wants to build another house on their property, it can only be 800 square feet. That's it. No ifs, ands, or buts. If you want to split a lot, then you can build 2 units. They can each be 800 square feet on each parcel. So you have a total of 4 little rental units that you could put on your property, which I personally do not favor in Monte Sereno. I would like some flexibility. Also, because of the law, the owner of the property has to live in one of those units for 3 years. I don't think that's going to happen, and I think it'll be a legal challenge. I would like to see something a little less rigid, perhaps allowing people to have half of the normal zoning square footage house size. So if you have, for example, a 4,000 foot, sorry, a R144 zoning unit, instead of 6,000 feet, perhaps you could build 3,000. And instead of the second unit being 800, maybe that goes by ADU rules. I can give you all sorts of reasons for this, but I don't have time. Also, on your vacant splits, you would go down to half the zoning rules. So if you had a 1 acre lot, you could go down to a 3,000 foot house here and a 3,000 foot house here, an ADU and an ADU. So you would get no more than you're getting now. It would discourage people from having lots of little rental units all over the property. So I've got another option, which I don't want to consider here. So I then looked at real life. Here is an R144 lot. Existing, you can build a 6,000 foot house. In the future with SB9, you would only need to be able to build a 3,000 foot house ministerially. If you wanted to build a 6,000 foot house, you would still go to site and architecture to get it done. You would not be allowed to build secondary units if you go to site and architecture. If you do an urban lot split, you would end up with a smaller lot. So instead of an acre, you'll end up with a half an acre. So your house size will go down. You will go down to 4,500 feet, and your ministerial approval would be half of that. So it would be 2,250 square feet. And so you would get significantly less than you're getting on your 6,000 feet lot. And if you want to go to site and architecture and get a real house on it, you could. But site and architecture would have to prove that, and it would be reasonable. If you had an R120, similarly, you can go to site and architecture and do it normally, or ministerially, you can do a baby house, but not an 800 foot unit and an ADU size house. If you go to an urban lot split, you would only be able to build 3,000 foot houses with S&A approval, or half of that, 1,500 feet with SB9 approval, and you can build a second house. That is what I see happening. The problem occurs with if you choose to split an R18 lot, which I hope is not going to happen very often. The town has, or the city has to come up with rules for very small lots, less than 5,000 feet. And Diana has to come up with some ideas. Maybe that gets restricted to 1,500 or 1,000 or 800. That was the basis of what I was trying to get across in a series of tables. I hope I've explained it reasonably well, but it all boils down to, at the very beginning, I believe the council is asking you to either ratify the 800 foot limit or provide a reasonable alternative that makes sense. And I can't do that in 3 minutes, but there is my quick cut. If you have questions, I would be delighted to go over them with you. There are lots of reasons I've chosen the numbers I did.
Thank you, Mr. Jeans. Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Jeans? All right, thank you very much, Mr. Jeans. Appreciate it. Appreciate the time you spent with Commissioner Harrington and I today. Thank you. Anybody else that wants to speak? I see Justin.
Good evening.
Good evening, Justin.
Hi, I just wanted to say that thank you to Tony for putting that together. That was actually an excellent explanation of some options that we could potentially pursue. My only comments would be to kind of just add on to that, I agree that I think the preference for myself and what I see for the community moving forward would be to find a solution where we can have living places where, people will actually want to live on them in perpetuity, and not have multiple small little apartments all around, kind of nestled into corners, so that we can get square footage onto properties. So I just like to, I don't know about the numbers precisely, but to me, that seems like a great proposal that I would really encourage that we look into a little bit further.
All right. Thank you very much. Anybody else that wants to communicate tonight about their thoughts on this particular legislation? All right, seeing no other hands raised, I'm going to close the public comment portion of our meeting. Just make it quick sure I don't see anybody else. And now it is amongst us commissioners to discuss. I believe the statute accurately reflects the desires and direction delivered to us by the City Council at the joint meeting last Monday. I believe that the additional items that were raised in that meeting have been appropriately incorporated into the legislation, or proposed legislation, I should say. I think that Mr. Jean's remarks are well taken, and I think if we were to recommend that the City Council adopt this legislation, that we do so with a request that they give consideration to what effect a series of small 8,000 square foot structures might have should people take advantage of this opportunity to put multiple structures on a lot, or split lots, or urban split lots. And I think there are a couple other considerations tonight that might be worthwhile for consideration, but I'd like to hear from my fellow commissioners. So with that, does anybody else have views on the proposed recommendation of this legislation to the City Council and other considerations that we might encourage the City Council to make before adoption?
I have a couple of just fine tuning comments on specific items that were addressed. I assume that if we recommend that the City Council pass the legislation, we can recommend that they pass it with some minor modifications. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So one that came to mind, we had talked about in the joint work session, whether to prohibit porches and covered patios. And then staff did not recommend prohibiting them. As a middle ground, I was thinking, we were also encouraged to think about our own properties and how things are laid out. And so we could consider things pragmatically. We have a 800 square foot unit, and it has a covered porch, and it's 8 feet by 8 feet, and it's quite proportionate to the structure. So I thought about it, and what occurred to me is perhaps we could allow 150 square feet of covered patio to allow, there's in the proposed design guidelines, the objective standards rather, there's a 50 square foot front porch near the front door. So the reason I came to 150 was perhaps we could have a 50-foot front porch and then allow a 10 by 10 or whatever dimensions, 100 square feet covered patio, off the back of the structure, or where else someone might want it. That was just an idea to kind of make a compromise. Does anyone want to talk about that particular idea, or talking about any other point in the proposed?
Go ahead, Heather. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go.
I was just going to say, I agree with you, Allison. I think that excluding porches from these units, I also have a little studio in my backyard, which I do actually rent out to my adult children's friends and to subsidize low income people. But I think that for one, adding porches is going to make that 4-foot setback. Those are going to have to be within the setback. So it's going to help move any units further away from property lines, which I think is helpful. And I do think it softens the building. So I would 100% agree with you, Allison.
Anybody else on that topic?
I agree. I don't have any other comment. I agree with both Commissioner Seidler and Commissioner Harrington.
So I like the idea of pushing back properties away from that 4-foot property line. I am concerned about outdoor living spaces and their impact on neighbors that may have smaller setbacks than we ordinarily see in improvements here in the city. We live in a state which doesn't have any rain, which is another issue for another day. But it means that we can be outside quite often. And now with heating elements that allow for covered porches and outdoor TVs and outdoor kitchens, that area could be a source of a nuisance to neighbors. And I am concerned about those types of improvements creating problems for people if we're going to be so close with this 4-foot setback. I just worry about that creating problems for neighbors. That's my principal focus on that. And then ancillary to that is, whether this is appropriate for consideration in the legislation element. This is a question for both Ms. Perkins and Mr. Rudin, whether this is appropriate for consideration in relationship to the legislation, or whether this is something that would be more appropriate as adoption in something or some element of the objective standards that we're going to consider later tonight. I don't know which is appropriate in that instance.
So with that, I think ultimately the commission can think about it as to whether or not you're thinking about imposing that specifically on these SB9 projects, or if you might want to have a limit on covered patios, porches, et cetera, that apply to a broader class of projects. If you want to apply it to a broader class of projects, I would consider putting it into your design guidelines rather than your SB9 ordinance, which is, I think, more specific to the SB9 projects. I think perhaps I'm going to kick this question a little bit to you, Diana, to discuss a little bit about how the city determines square footage limits and what counts as square footage for the purposes of a building. As I understand it right now, at present, this ordinance doesn't limit any sort of covered outdoor space. So maybe you can explain how staff would interpret, whether or not it would count against the allowed 800 square foot or whatever other size limit ultimately is adopted.
Yes, thank you. The 800 square foot limit that is proposed tonight would include interior space and any covered porch area that is enclosed on 3 sides. So for example, if you have a recessed entry, then the square footage that's enclosed on 3 sides of the building is included in the building area. But generally a porch or patio cover that extends out from the structure would not be included in the building area limit. It would, however, be included in both the structural coverage for the overall lot as well as the impervious coverage for the overall lot.
And it would also be subject to the setback requirements.
Yes, it would.
So it would have the effect of pushing the structure away from the neighbor. Okay, thank you.
My concern is kind of proportionality and privacy, because if the units built are 800 square feet and with the ministerial approvals and such, if the only limits on the size of the covered patio are the structural coverage rules and the impervious coverage rules, you could get a very large covered patio, perhaps one that's as large as the building itself. That was my concern. And I feel like if we perhaps allow for a covered patio that is proportionate, it might prevent a very large covered patio being allowed.
I think that's a great idea because it addresses my concern, which is creating essentially another living space so large outside that it creates a nuisance for neighbors. And if we could limit it in size, that would ameliorate my concerns and not interfere with the ability to create a structure that's at least 8,000 square feet. Other commissioners have comments?
You mean 800?
800, excuse me, 8,000. 800, thank you, Allison.
Mhm.
If I could just add also, if you do choose to include some limitation on the porches and covered patios in your motion tonight, if you could specify if it would be, for example, 150 combined, or if you want to specify 50 for the front porch and 100 for other patio covers.
Okay, good. Thank you. Commissioners, you guys have thoughts on the size, or is everybody in agreement that this is probably appropriate?
I think it's appropriate. The only question I have is that we're talking, what's the ratio that we're talking about? Living space versus, let's say, an exterior patio area. I mean, is there a specific ratio that you're talking about? Are you just talking about a flat limit of 125 square feet, or what is it? I'm sorry.
I don't think that's been defined, and I think that's the challenge to us right now. If we're all in agreement that something like this should be an element of what we're recommending to the city council, the hard part now becomes defining it sufficiently so it can be part of the legislation.
Just want to make sure I didn't miss it along the way there. Okay.
No.
The draft design guidelines or the objective standards, they call for 50-foot minimum 50 square feet porch. So I think, to make it consistent with that proposal, if we adopt that proposal, perhaps we would do 50 plus 100.
So it's a 10 by 10 area in the rear, essentially. So
Right.
that would be a little over a tenth of the size of the structure, right?
Right.
In terms of proportion.
Seems reasonable.
I think that sounds reasonable to me. Anyone else have thoughts?
I think so as well. Yeah.
I think it's reasonable.
Okay.
So if I understand that correctly, what is being discussed would be a specific 50 square foot limit for the front and another not more than 100 square foot limit for any other covered patio or porch space.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, sorry guys. Thinking about it a little bit further, if somebody does as the two people from both Justin and Tony commented on in the public element, if they're going to build a larger structure and they're not going to limit it to 800 square feet, then 50 may not be big enough in the front. And 100 would be woefully too small.
That in that case, then the right ratio, some kind of a ratio would make sense more than a square footage amount, I think.
Right, because I guess the SB 9 units being 100 square feet, that's not set in stone yet.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, who's got their calculator?
Who's the mathematician amongst us? Well, maybe we can do it this way. Maybe we can direct staff to come up with that ratio, instead of wasting people's time tonight doing the math. And do you have sufficient direction in that respect, Ms. Perkins, or do you need something more from the commission?
Just one point of clarification is that this would be part of the SB 9 ordinance.
That's what I was suggesting.
Okay.
And that was my question, and I think Mr. Radin answered that it should be if it's going to apply to projects, all projects essentially that are subject to SB 9. Am I get that right, Sergio? Sorry.
Yes, if we're talking specifically about a covered porches, patios, limit for these SB 9 projects, I would recommend putting it in the SB 9 ordinance at this point. And, just in terms of the ratio that we're discussing, 150 square feet, divided by 800 square feet, that gives us 18%. So in theory, you'd be looking at something along the lines of an 18% ratio in terms of interior space to, permitted exterior covered space.
Okay.
And I would suggest that I don't know if you want to split it between front and back, because some people may have like space in the side to build it. So we may not need to necessarily split it by front and back.
Well, the goal of the covered porch was to create some sort of architectural feature in the front of the home where the entrance is. So third of it, if I did the math right, would be in the front, and 2/3 would be either on the side or the rear, wherever it's permissible.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Does that work? Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Other considerations in relationship to this legislation that we want to discuss tonight. Anybody have anything more in that respect?
Well, I
I
just
have
had
another.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Allison.
Okay. Regarding the impervious coverage, I was thinking about swimming pools. I'm concerned because we're taking larger lots. In some cases, you'll have a house that's landscaped close to the impervious coverage limits that then subdivides the parcel, and then we proceed to build on that second parcel. So there will be instances where we go over the impervious coverage limits that we've deemed environmentally advisable and such. So I think we need to be very careful about not allowing a lot of impervious coverage, even if the new parcel meets the standards. That combined former acre or whatever original parcel size it was will be over what we have historically deemed advisable. So with that long lead in, I think perhaps we might want to consider not allowing swimming pools or sports courts, at least impervious coverage. You can have a sports court perhaps that water filters through, but not a swimming pool.
Mr. Udine, are there any limitations on limiting the types of amenities that Ms. Zeeler raises?
I think that that's a objective standard. You can have a prohibition on impervious coverage, for pools and for sports courts. I think that would be fine.
Okay. So we should probably return to this when we're considering adoption of the proposed objective standards.
And you could also insert this into the SB9 ordinance as well, because if this is something that you guys are considering just for this class of ministerial type projects, and it's not something that you think is going to apply outside of the context of SB9 projects, then I think it's perfectly fine to stick it in the SB9 ordinance.
Okay. Commissioners, what do you feel about Allison's suggestion?
I think she's got a very valid point that impervious coverage becomes so important. If we start paving over our whole city, it's going to affect storm drains and everything else. And we need to be very careful on what we allow. I think Allison's edits are good points with the sport court and swimming pools. And maybe we need to discuss what the appropriate percentage of impervious coverage would be. Is it the same as what a lot normally is once it's split? Is that what we're proposing? Sorry if this is in here and I'm overlooking it.
Yeah, so the question becomes, would ordinary zoning impervious limitations apply to both applications to construct two structures on a lot or do an urban lot split? And maybe the answer is different depending on which one you look at. I don't know. Can Ms. Perkins or Mr. Rudin help us in that respect?
So, yes, you could, I believe Sergio can correct me if I'm wrong, but you could have different impervious coverage standards for a 2-unit development or for the urban lot split, or a project that uses both.
That is correct. You can set different impervious coverage requirements than what we have. The issue is the SB9 legislation says you cannot enact objective standards, including impervious coverage limits that prohibit the construction of the two permitted 800 square foot units. So that's sort of your baseline. The ordinances as drafted would require that persons applying for these ministerial approvals comply with the city's existing impervious coverage standards and structural coverage standards applicable to the zoning district, except to the extent that they would prohibit the construction of the permitted 800 square foot units. So if you have a single family lot with a large property on it that has a substantial amount of impervious coverage, the SB 9 legislation says you have to allow them to construct that additional 800 square foot unit. And additionally, you can't require correction of non-conforming zoning conditions. So that's one of the issues there. But as written, the ordinances would require compliance with the applicable structural and impervious coverage limitations. That being said, I don't think that the city would be prohibited from imposing stricter impervious coverage requirements or structural coverage requirements for these types of projects and parcels if that was desired, provided that you don't eliminate the ability to construct at least the 800 square foot units.
All right, so what types of amenities are we specifically considering, or do we want to go with an impervious standard that's different from regular zoning?
I think,
Lots of steam coming out of ears, I see.
yeah. Go ahead, Bobby.
So what I was asking is, so as far as I know, if someone wants to construct a swimming pool, they still have to go through a permit process for this. So wouldn't that be the appropriate place where we would be able to catch if this is going to affect, drainage and other issues and grading and things like that? And if that's already in place, and if with at least what we're proposing right now, which is a limit on the size of these houses that are being built, don't really see a reason to specifically call that out in the ordinance.
I think we should limit it to, let's just discuss different options. Do we keep the impervious coverage the same as what it would be typically for the zoning that it already would be in? So let's say an R120 lot or an R144 lot, Diana could tell us what the impervious coverage number is. So let's say let's do an R144, it gets divided to 2 half-acre lots. So then they go into the zoning of the half-acre lots, and do they comply with the impervious coverage allowed for those for a half-acre lot? That's one option. Or we could make it, if it's a SB 9 division, do we make it more restrictive on impervious coverage?
So what I was recommending is what you proposed formally, the first one.
Yes.
That it should be just the same. Yeah.
Diana, can you tell us what the impervious coverage is for R144 and for R120?
Yes, for R144, the structural coverage is 20%. The impervious coverage maximum is 30%. And then for the R120, the structural coverage is 30% maximum, and the impervious is 40%.
Okay, but it's really impervious coverage we're discussing at the moment. So 30% on both counts. Is there anybody that's interested in making it more restrictive on these SB 9 lots?
I would be open to that. Because I feel unless you can make reference to, and I thought about asking Sergio this, but if you could refer in the coverage calculations to the historical lot, the original lot originally created by the city, and setting the coverage limitations on that new divided parcel, that would kind of make it easier, but I have a feeling that might not be allowed. And if that's not allowed, we might need to lower some of the coverage limitations to not effectively, as you put it, casually, pave over our city.
So one thought I have, okay, so let's just compare again, R144 to changing it to R120 by splitting it. So it was 30%, it goes to 30%, but that original lot becomes 60% impervious coverage. So especially the hillside lots, that becomes too much in my opinion. It's a lot of coverage where there once wasn't. So I do think we should maybe restrict on these SB9 splits. Anybody else?
I agree.
I agree. Do we cut them in half?
I think we cut them in half.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then my thought through this whole, I'll say this now, just as we're considering all of this, my thought is if people with R144s, because there has been some voice of people that would like to maybe split their lots. Tony Jeans had told us he's been contacted by a few people that want to age in their homes and are running out of, need a way to raise more funds to be able to stay in Monte Sereno that would sell off part of their lots. And they're in R144 districts. I mean, I think if that's what our city wants, it should be proposed to the city council to change the general plan and allow for subdivisions in R144. But that's a whole nother project and a different route than what we're doing tonight. So that's kind of how I have it separated in my mind, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
No, it does. I drew the same conclusion after talking to Mr. Jeans today, that's something appropriate for the general plan and not something that's before us tonight. But I do like this idea about shrinking the impervious coverage caps for these lots because they're being divided in half.
Yeah, let's do that. If everyone's in agreement, I think we should take it and make it so it ends up being divided into half or stays with the original impervious coverage. So divide by 2 or 60-40, whatever the lot percentage ends up being, because you can go to 60-40 on these lots in any instance, depending upon the constraints, but it's half, it should equal what the original was. Am I not making any sense? I look at everyone's faces.
No. It should be in the same percentage of the division of the lot. So if the lot's divided 60-40, then we're going to have 60-40 in relationship to the reduction in the overall impervious cover, or that in half, I should say. Patrick and Pallavi.
So just so I can make sure I understand the concept here, so that when I have to drop the language, the idea would be that upon approval of an urban lot split, each lot shall be required to comply with the coverage limit that would have applied, or the percentage of the impervious and structural coverage limit that would have applied to the portion of that parcel.
We're only talking impervious coverage, though. I don't think we're discussing.
Okay. No structural coverage. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So then really the impervious coverage limit that would apply to each urban lot split lot would be based on the percentage that lot was of the original lot multiplied by the applicable impervious coverage limit of the original lot, if we were doing math formula.
Yes.
Okay.
So if I can add one point here, the impervious coverage calculation includes the structural coverage
function or immediate development
plus any additional impervious areas. So I don't believe we can have an impervious coverage that's less than the structural coverage.
Yes, that I agree with that. And also we can't set the impervious coverage in such a manner as it would prohibit the construction of the 2 800 square foot units, but it may ultimately decrease, things like accessory structures. It may eliminate the ability to have a driveway potentially. So those are some considerations there.
I feel like,
I have a neighbor whose driveway is permeable pavers, so you would still be able to have driveways.
yes. I think we should I mean, we can make our recommendation to the city council, but I really think this should be studied on each zone. So R18, how it affects each one and what the effect would be. So we can know what these numbers are and we don't find ourselves in like a legal tangle. And Sergio, I know you'll keep us out of that. But we just need to make sure all the numbers jive on the smaller lots. I think they work for the larger lots. I think for the smaller lots, we need to make sure we're still allowing for the 800 square foot minimum that we have to.
All right, then what do you propose that we, if we recommend this legislation to the city council with the amendments we've already made in relationship to covered structures, that it comes also with a recommendation that staff provide a report regarding what reductions in impervious areas would look like for each different zoning area. Is that right?
Yes, but no matter what, if you think about it, like Allison said, if you use permeable pavers, and I think the smallest lot we have in our city is like 7,000. Is that right, Diana? Do you know? Square feet. If it were
I don't know specifically, but I think it is probably right around there.
I think it's around 7,000 square feet. So you could do a 60-40 split, roughly 4,000, 3,000. No one, I don't think, is going to do this. So let's say the smallest is 3,000. We need to be able to build 2 800 square foot units on a lot that small. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That is correct.
Well, that's going to be kind of tough. So I guess we put.
And just for reference, the maximum impervious coverage for an R18 lot is 60%. So that does make it a little bit easier to comply with that.
Sure.
Also, the ordinance as written requires compliance with the impervious and structural coverage of the applicable zoning district. Subject to that, that those requirements will not apply if they prohibit the construction of the 2 800 square foot units. So that's already in our ordinance. Okay. To avoid that legal tangle. Okay. We could have, again, we can draft our additional impervious coverage restrictions on larger lots accordingly as well, just to avoid that same sort of quandary.
Okay. That sounds good.
So one thing, if I might suggest, is, so as has been mentioned, if you use a 1 acre R144 lot as an example, and if it were divided into 2 lots, under our current zoning regulations, you would use the structural coverage and impervious coverage of the R120 zoning district, because that's the zoning district that the lot size is closest to, which allows a higher percentage of structural and impervious coverage. So as a suggestion, what if we could require the structural and impervious coverages specifically to remain as allowed for the actual zoning district and not what our zoning code calls the effective zoning district, which on the larger lots are smaller percentages.
There's a real simplicity to that approach. I like that.
Yeah.
Does that reduce them, which is our goal here?
Effectively, I think that it would, just because the maximum structural coverage and impervious coverage for R144, so structural is 20%, impervious is 30. For R120, it is 30% structural, 40% impervious, and for R18, it is 40% and 60%. So, if you're having to comply with the original zoning district as designated on the city's zoning maps, then you are subject to a more restrictive impervious coverage requirement.
But not so, because we just went over our 144 is 30% and our 120 is also 30%. So it's not, they're equal in percentage.
The R144 impervious coverage is 30%,
Yes.
and the R120 is actually 40%.
Oh, okay, so it is different. So we were trying to restrict it, just to reiterate and rehash this again, keeping that R144 and dividing it in two so that we don't end up with a lot of paved over hillside.
Correct. That's the goal. Yes.
That's the goal. So what Diana's suggesting doesn't meet our goal, correct?
I think it does, because it doesn't change what's allowed today.
Well, maybe we do this, guys. I think that maybe whatever we decide in relationship to this legislation is coupled with, and I hate to do this to staff, but some study and illustration of what the impervious and structural coverages will look like in these lots, and the commission's recommendation that those be reduced if appropriate in the minds of the city council. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think that specific change that was suggested that Heather was responding to, I think it does help with the problem, but we will still end up with more impervious coverage than before SB 9 lot splits. Because if you take a 1 acre lot and split it in half, you're going to build a new structure on the undeveloped half, basically. So the house and pavers that you leave on the original parcel would be over, it'd be then non-conforming. And you get to start from scratch with your coverage, restrictions on the new parcel. So we still, even though retaining the coverage of the original zoning district helps, we will still end up with basically more pavement than we did before.
I have a question though for Diana or Sergio. Can we require the original building, house or whatever, like you've just described, can we require them to reduce impervious coverage to conform in order to do the lot split?
No.
Okay.
No. Again, one of the issues is that the lot split provision in SB 9 specifically says you can't require correction of non-conforming zoning conditions. So in that case, we would consider that a non-conforming zoning condition.
Okay.
Even though we're creating it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's one more reason to maybe limit the new lot that's created in impervious coverage to compensate for the over coverage on the original lot. Okay, let's move on.
All right, yeah, and Ms. Perkins, do you have sufficient direction from us? Do you understand what we're wanting the city council to consider? We want the city council to consider including increased restrictions on impervious coverage limits, but don't have sufficient information tonight to make a real concrete recommendation in that respect.
So I will say, just as a pragmatic sort of observation on where we are today, the council is going to be meeting on December 21st, and we do need a recommendation, firm or otherwise, particularly with respect to the urgency legislation. But with respect to doing any additional studies, again, I think given the fact that there are going to be two ordinances coming before council, and the council is, going to have the opportunity to make further corrections or modifications via the regular ordinance, that might be something that happens later on down the road, potentially. So that would be sort of my observation if staff had to do any sort of significant study on this. With respect to, reducing the impervious coverage based on the original zoning district prior to a lot split, I think that's pretty straightforward to write. That is something that could be added to the urgency ordinance now, if that's the recommendation of the commission. So, I'll leave it to you folks if you want to recommend that now or not.
I think it's two different things. If there's if it's a fresh lot that's being split, then adhering to the original may be a good idea. But if there's already construction, if there's already a house, if there's already a lot of paved area, I think that's the concern that Commissioner Seidler's citing, that then we may end up with way too much. So I think we may need a if but kind of a clause in there.
All right. I want to move on, but this is important.
Did we decide to move away from the no swimming pools, no sports courts?
Well, we did only in the sense that we were going to address it by way of impervious coverage restrictions.
That's impervious.
I don't feel comfortable making a recommendation to the city council without seeing a study and some illustration of how various restrictions may affect these circumstances under which two structures may be constructed on a lot or an urban lot split is made. And if somebody does, help me out to understand what that's going to look like and what type of restriction you want. But in the absence of that, it sounds like the best recommendation we can make is that this be studied and be a part of consideration of amendments to the regular ordinance, and that the emergency ordinance, because it is an emergency ordinance, be adopted in the form already prepared. Does that seem to address your concerns, Mr. Rudin?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I expect the council will want to take some sort of action on legislation, that is in ready form more or less to adopt on December 21st.
Okay.
Could we do both? Could we recommend that they retain the coverage zoning of the original parcel and study it further to maybe go one step further? So at least we've addressed it somewhat. Sometimes something's better than nothing.
Legally, yes. Whether you want to as a policy matter, I will leave it for you folks to figure out.
Well, don't the original zoning apply? I thought we solved that early on.
No, what we're saying is, let's use the R144 example. So they have 30% impervious coverage. If you take that, you divide it into 2 lots, and then it goes to 40% on each of those 2 lots. It's very different from 30% would be 15% per lot, give or take, on the R144.
Right, if you didn't even, okay.
So we want to keep it similar if we can to what the original was, so that we don't end up with paved over hillsides. And there's a lot of ways to get around that too. I mean, an R120 lot is large. They can have a 2-story structure. They can use impervious pavers and get around kind of the impervious coverage by being creative. But I do feel like it's an important thing with our natural hillside to not cover it with pavement. So that would be my suggestion, is to just say it stays within the original percentage divided by whatever percentage the lot is. And then, as Mr. Rudin suggested, put in the caveat that the 2 800 square foot units must be allowed to be built on that, regardless of impervious coverage. And I'm sure you lawyers could say that better than me. Sorry.
No, I think that's good. I think I can support that. Yeah, no, I think that's good. And then further studies be done in relationship to adoption of the regular ordinance to see if that, practically speaking, is a worthwhile restriction. But for now, our recommendation for this ordinance is going to include retention of the original zoned impervious coverage limitations divided in relationship to how the lot is divided percentage-wise.
Yes.
So,
Good.
not to belabor the point, but if I could just
Oh, I'm not so sure what I said made any sense. So you're not belaboring anything.
make a comment. So the impervious coverage limit is a percent of the lot area. So as in the, again, the 1 acre lot example, as that lot is divided in half,
Mhm.
if it is exactly 1 acre, each resulting lot would be just under 22,000.
Right.
So the coverage would be a percentage of 22,000.
Yeah, so it would be, so if you took that original lot and you divided the percentage in half, so 15%, it would be 15% of 22,000.
The original lot size, in just for an example, let's say is 44,000
Correct?
for the R144. Currently, you can have 30% coverage,
Yes,
which would be 13,200 square feet total.
okay. So I'm
If you
saying,
divide the 44,000.
yeah, it'd be the 44,000 divided by 15%, times 15% would be what we would have for the impervious coverage. Which is the same thing as saying,
But if we're talking about the urban lot splits, the 44,000 lot would now be to approximately 22,000 square foot lots.
correct,
So the 30% coverage is 30% of 22,000
but
versus
30%,
30%.
the 30% of 22, this is what we're trying to avoid. So 30% of 22,000 plus another 30% of 20. Am I doing the math wrong here? Let me just.
It would be the same, right? Because you'd add the two. At least in this instance, what you're explaining, it would be the same.
In
Yes.
general, smaller lots get higher coverage allowances, right? But we don't want that to happen.
Yes.
We even though the lots get
Right.
smaller, we don't want them to be allowed to have higher coverage ratios. We want them to retain the coverage ratios they were zoned originally.
Right.
Could I just, I think Sergio understood what we were trying to say and phrased it well, and he's the one that will probably be doing the drafting. So
Yeah, if I understand it correctly, so the reason we're having this issue is that our zoning district regulations in each of the regulations have language in there that says each parcel or property or lot, as the case may be, having either more or less lot area than the minimum required in this residential zoning district shall comply with all regulations of the zoning district whose minimum lot area is closest. So basically what we would do is not apply that language to urban lot splits. And so, for example, if you had an an R120 parcel that was 20,000 square feet, right? And so the zoning district says that it's entitled to a 30% coverage. If it got split into two, normally, if it was approved by a subdivision map that was discretionary, we would start applying the R18 zoning district regulations, which have an increased coverage. But here we wouldn't. We would still apply that 30% coverage to each lot that was created, since they're now, say, if they were split 50-50, we went from a 120,000 square foot lot to two 10,000 square foot lots. Each lot would be entitled to 30% coverage. If they were split 60-40, then we'd have a 12,000 square foot lot. Don't quote my math on this one, but that one would be entitled to a slightly higher percentage of coverage, potentially. So,
It sounds accurate to me.
Yes.
Well done.
okay.
All right, good. Great, we can move on. Any other considerations in relationship to this proposed legislation that we're going to be making a recommendation to the city council about? I know Flavia, you had one. I don't know if Allison, you finished. I'm sorry.
I have more too.
All right.
Great turns.
No, you've great ones so far. So let's hear more.
This stuff. So the /decks, do we want to say no rooftop decks? Because I know we're going to probably keep it at 16 feet high, but someone could conceivably have quite a elaborate rooftop deck if we allowed it. and that would impact privacy. So I suggest top deck.
Sorry, I thought I saw in the proposed language that there were no balconies, or was there, maybe if they missed the rooftop deck, then I think, yes, we should add that.
Yeah, I think they said second floor decks and balconies, but rooftops may be a little different.
Call it
Maybe
out.
so.
Correct.
Yeah. That was suggested to us, was to prohibit second floor decks and or balconies, and I would support that.
Yeah, our language is second story or exterior decks and balconies shall be prohibited on dwelling units constructed under this section. So Diana, do you think that's sufficiently clear in terms of your, because you're going to be enforcing this, do we need to add rooftops specifically to this section? Because that's very easy to do.
Yes, I think that would make it clear, more clear.
I concur. I think that's a good idea. Let's do that. Everyone else in agreement?
Yep.
Great. But Allison, what's your next brilliant idea?
This one I may not gain traction, but I'm still concerned about the trees. And perhaps Ms. Perkins could explain, but with the ministerial approval of permits, I'm wondering in what instance a tree removal request would be denied. Are there any? Because I'm just concerned that we'll get some mature old 100-year oaks cut down for 800 square foot units.
Count on it.
Can I use an example for it? Just my next door, this will maybe make it easier for Diana to answer. Sorry to interject, but my next door neighbor, there's an oak tree that pretty much covers half of my lot, half of the lot on the other side, and the whole front portion of it's probably 500 years old. And it's one of the most beautiful, majestic trees, I think, in our city. And someone could easily, if it were not precluded, go in on an R18 lot, because if the placement of the original house is in the back portion of the property, cut that tree down and build a house in front of it. Is there anything we can do? This is what you're asking, right, Allison? Is there anything we can do to preclude that kind of situation?
And again, one question where I thought that the code added that we would still need a permit to remove any significant tree. So thank you for raising this, because I was under the impression that we solved this problem.
You do need a permit, but with the ministerial approval, unless there are objective standards that allow the city to deny the permit will just be approved as a matter of course. So that was my initial question, is can you deny basically a tree removal request? And if not as drafted, can we add something to protect at least the most mature oak?
Like heritage trees, which we don't really have per se.
Yeah, and this is an area where I think Diana and I struggle, and I know other cities have struggled with this area as well, because one of the issues is that as part of being a ministerial approval process, it also has to be non-discretionary. So one of the issues is we looked at ways we could try to draft this, to avoid a discretionary determination by the city planner or building official, which is ultimately going to be subject to challenge by the applicant about, it would just be very difficult to draft in a way that doesn't obligate the planner or the building official to make a discretionary judgment as to whether or not that tree should be removed or not removed. With respect to, we thought about ways of, say, restricting significant tree removals over a certain size, unless it was absolutely necessary to, say, construct one of the permitted 800 square foot units. The problem is how do you, as a building official or planner, determine that it is in fact absolutely necessary, via some sort of objective standard. So, I mean, we could draft a requirement that there be no other site configuration available. But again, that requires a very significant amount of discretion. And that is the key problem.
I suggest that we draft a requirement or just state that no oak that's either like pick either 2 feet in diameter or 3 feet in diameter. I looked at a bunch of cities' regulations about what they deem heritage oaks, which heritage is not really usually a technical definition, but I looked at different cities, and the biggest I saw as a minimum was 3 feet. And then I saw some that were 2 feet or even smaller. But if we just say that you're not allowed to remove a heritage oak, which we deem to be either 2 feet across or 3 feet across, unless not being allowed to remove that tree would preclude building. I think that's an objective, clear standard. My own parents, when they built their house, they wrapped the house around a mature oak. It was a ranch, and they just put a U in the ranch around the tree. So there's always a way to do it. And I don't think any of us would want to see the tree in Commissioner Harrington's yard cut down for a
Next door, yeah.
square
Well,
foot.
but there's no way they're gonna build without removing that tree if they chose to do it. So they could come in and say, there's no way around it. Though, I mean, it's gotta be 8 feet in diameter, at least, and it's multi-trunk. So they could easily come in and say, hey, we can't do this lot split under SB 9 and build the 800 square foot in any other spot in the lot, because the lot's already small. So it would already be going to, 4,000 square feet or less. They'd have to remove the tree, and they would have permission to remove the tree. I don't think there's anything we can do. Am I right?
Well, even if we can't prevent it on your lot, which I hope we can, there may be others where we can prevent it. If we
Yeah.
a tree over 3 feet in no oak over 3 feet in diameter may be removed, period, unless it prohibits development. That may save a few.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my concern here though is, because of the standards in SB 9 with respect to when you may deny a project, and I think refusing to grant a permit may be claimed by an applicant, whether true or whether the courts agree with an applicant in this matter, I think is going to be open to determination by the courts. But the risk here is an applicant says, the statute says that a local agency may only deny proposed housing development if the building official makes a written finding based upon preponderance of the evidence that a proposed housing development project would have a specific adverse impact as defined by the Housing Accountability Act upon public health and safety or the physical environment for which there is no feasible method to satisfactorily mitigate or avoid the specific adverse impact. And so the risk here is that by denying a tree removal permit, they're going to allege that the city has unlawfully denied a project without identifying a specific, public health or safety impact. I think that that's not a trivial risk for, these kinds of tree removal requests if they're going to basically invalidate a permit approval. So that would be my concern as the city attorney.
Well, they can't build in the setback. We tell them places they can't build, namely the setback. They can't build maybe on top of a 100-year-old tree. They'll just have to move it elsewhere on the lot. Denying a tree removal request just means they have to move the structure. You don't have to approve exactly where they want to place it necessarily. Nothing says that, does it?
No, and actually that does make sense in terms of how you would also enforce your remaining objective standards. So that does make sense.
I think we
can't the statute read in such a way that, go ahead, I'm sorry, Allison.
I think you just put the same language that you've put elsewhere about unless such restriction would preclude being able to build your 800 square foot property.
I agree. And do we have to limit it to, why can't we just make that true for all significant trees? That's defined in our municipal code as it is.
Well, and then I think at that point, then the other question that I think was raised by planning staff was, well, would you prefer to save one significant tree if it requires that one of these SB9 developments get moved closer to, property lines or closer, to a neighbor's adjacent property, or ultimately be required to do significantly more grading than they might otherwise? I think Diana can probably create some more hypotheticals here in terms of how this might play out in the real world.
Right. It's understood. And that's a good point.
My understanding is oaks are native to this area. The redwoods aren't native to the valley. And I guess we're kind of in the foothills, but a lot of the redwoods aren't doing well anyhow. And they're the other significant trees, right? That are the most protective have been the redwoods and the oaks. But I don't think having a redwood in a 4-unit lot works anyhow. Whereas the oaks, they've done better with the climate change. They're heritage trees. They're native. They support wildlife. I think they should be protected, at least the big.
Okay, so if we're going to do something like that and protect oaks, as you pointed out earlier, Allison, you identified a particular circumference that was, these aren't going to be small oaks, for example. They're going to have to be large oaks that have been there for some significant period of time. Do other commissioners have any opposition to drafting something that would address this concern?
Nope.
No objection.
Okay. Then let's identify the circumference that we're going to recommend be incorporated into amendments to the proposed statute. You said 2 feet and 3 feet or some other municipalities that you reviewed. Does anybody have a strong opinion about the circumference size? All right. Significant trees have a circumference greater than 20 inches at a height of 48 inches above natural grade. We're trying to make this we're trying to identify a more significant tree than a significant tree when we're doing this task here now. So my suggestion would be that we be at a minimum 24 inches, and maybe we make this 3 feet. I think 3 feet, quite frankly. The more I consider, the more I consider it, because that's the type of tree that's going to be addressed on your neighbor's lot. I know the one to the right of you there, Heather, and beautiful tree. I agree. All right, everybody good with 36 inches at a height of 48 inches?
Yeah, and usually the way, a lot of times they're drafted by circumference. So just take the 3 feet, and multiply it by pi. We should probably do it as circumference.
Yeah, I think that's how we're defining significant trees in the municipal code as it is. So that's appropriate. But that measurement is taken at 48 inches above grade as opposed to grade.
I'm sorry, if I could just clarify, are we wanting to say 36 inches in diameter or 36 inches in circumference?
Circumference, right?
But 36 inches in diameter, which is what we were talking about for purposes of this. If you say 36 inches times 3.14, it's 113 inches, if I did that right. So maybe, do we say 115 inches to make it a round number? Or does anyone have a thought on that?
Isn't it pi versus radius squared, if I recall correctly?
That's
not circumference.
We're circumference. So 36 inches times 3.14 is 113 inches. but maybe we round up to 115, or what do you think, Sergio?
I think 115 inches in circumference is very clear.
Okay.
All right, Allison, anything else that you've got for us?
No.
All right, Pallavi, I know you've got a couple thoughts.
Well, I guess my question was more on the actual language that was drafted. So I just wanted, my first question was on the grading, the engineering grading permit language. This was changed a lot, so I wanted to understand why we changed it, or was there something significant that prompted that change to comply with SB 9?
So with respect to the grading permit language, the main changes there are primarily this was intended to reflect the need to have ministerial approval for grading for SB 9 projects as well as may be necessary. And let me see if I can pull up the actual language and I can remember what exactly changed. And one of the other changes were, I think, clean up textual changes to clarify what engineered grading or cumulative grading means, because there were some ambiguous provisions in the code.
Thank you. And so can I ask my second question?
Of course.
So this was with the 13.06.20, the requirements for urban lot splits. In that, if you look at the section D, the second point that says housing that is subject to any form of rent or price control through public entities. So basically, I think this is this referring to like lots that have ADUs, for example? Like, so if folks have ADUs that were built under that, to rent out under below market rate ADUs, is that what that kind of protects that? Or maybe you would clarify that for me.
So housing that is subject to any form of rent or price control through public entities, valid exercise of police powers. So a number of jurisdictions, not including Monte Sereno, have rent control ordinances in place that restrict the ability to raise rent. I don't think that this necessarily applies to, and this is intended to mirror language straight out of SB 9. I don't think it's intended to apply to the state's statewide rent control provisions that cap rental increase. In general, I don't think that this would be applicable. This restriction would be applicable in Monte Sereno.
Okay, thank you. And then just going down that same line for the provision G, which says neither the owner or the parcel being subdivided or any person acting in concert will use an adjacent parcel for an urban lot split as provided. So is that to prevent like developers from coming in and buying, consecutive lots and then doing urban lot splits?
Yes, and that again also I think mirrors language straight out of the statute. So the issue with the statute, and whenever this happens, where language is ambiguous or unclear, staff will be charged with interpreting it based on advice of the city attorney, and that advice obviously is going to evolve as courts put meat on the bones of these provisional languages.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Those were all my questions.
Thank you, Pallavi, very much. Patrick, anything that you've given consideration for considering amendments or anything of that nature?
Nope, I'm good.
Thank you. And Heather?
I just had one clarification. So the required parking spot versus no required parking spot. So the city may not require more than one parking space for the properties within 1/2 mile walking distance and corridor, or within 1 block. So no parking spaces are required if you're within, like my neighborhood is within 1/2 mile of a bus stop. So does that mean that no parking space would be required? I'm just trying to figure out how it's going to impact the R18s close to Winchester.
So the actual language of the statute, which I believe our ordinance is intended to mirror, is that you can require off-street parking of up to one space per unit, except that a local agency shall not impose parking requirements in either of the following instances. The parcel is located within 1/2 mile walking distance of either a high-quality transit corridor as defined in applicable provision of the Public Resources Code, or a major transit stop as also defined in the Public Resources Code, or there is a car share vehicle located within 1 block of the parcel. So realistically, the high quality transit corridor and major transit stops, they require that that transit stop basically have a certain quality of service, which none of the transit, Diana, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is none of the transit stops in Monte Sereno meet that level of service requirement as present.
Correct. In order to qualify as a high quality transit corridor, it needs to have service at an interval of no more than 15 minutes during peak commute hours.
Okay, good to know. Okay, thank you. We can move on now.
So I have a question for Ms. Perkins and Mr. Rudin. I've seen some other municipalities impose restrictions relative to requiring that new structures be sold as either low or moderate income housing, which would have the practical effect of achieving more housing units, which I think the statute's intended to accomplish. And I'm curious what their thoughts are on consideration of inclusion of a requirement in that respect, with respect to what we're recommending to the city council.
So I will say that I can't say for certain that what those jurisdictions are doing is illegal. Okay. But I also wouldn't say that I would recommend it. And I think it takes a creative reading of what objective zoning standards means. One of the issues and the concerns that I have is that, at least with the urban lot split provision, there is express language in the statute that says a local agency shall not impose additional owner occupancy standards other than provided in the subdivision on an urban lot split. So the question, and obviously this is one of the reasons why I think there is some risk to local agencies imposing affordability requirements, is they may be challenged as, unlawful owner occupancy standards, or they may be challenged as standards other than the objective zoning and design standards that they're permitted to impose on these. So I think that there is some risk of challenge if you do intend to require those.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? I'm not interested in heading down that risk, but I did want to ask the question because having read about other jurisdictions doing that, I was curious what impact it might have here. All right, if that wraps up all of our considerations of amendments, then I'm going to make the motion that we recommend to the city council adoption of both the emergency ordinance and the regular ordinance with the following amendments to be prepared by city council. Number one, that we restrict covered exterior structures to 18% of the percentage of the proposed improvements, with 1/3 of that being in the front, 2/3 in the rear. The second amendment being that we retain the original impervious coverage restrictions for the zoning of the lot before it's split in an urban lot split circumstance. And that the third amendment is that oaks with a circumference of 115 inches or greater at 48 inches above grade be preserved in all instances, unless it can be demonstrated that no improvement can be constructed on the lot without removal of that tree. Does that wrap it up, guys?
And rooftop decks, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and no rooftop decks. Thank you, Claudia. Yes, I'm sorry for it.
I'd like to second the motion.
Well, Sergio, did you have a question? I just want to make sure.
No, I think Commissioner Sharma caught the issue that I was hoping to identify.
Okay, good. Glad you guys are both on it. All right, and Allison has a second, and Ms. Perkins, if you'll do a roll call, we can move on.
Commissioner Booker,
Yes.
Commissioner Harrington,
Yes.
Commissioner Sharma,
Yes.
Commissioner Zeidler,
Yes.
and Chair White.
Yes. All right, well done, folks. Thank you. All right, we are now going to move on to our second item on the agenda, which is to recommend the City Council adopt a resolution to incorporate the objective design standards addendum to the city's design guidelines. At the bottom of your reports, you'll see some documentation that was provided by Ms. Perkins, and I think the consulting group with whom we spoke some number of weeks and months ago as well. Ms. Perkins, do you want to introduce this particular agenda item, and then we can begin a public comment and discussion?
Yes, thank you. The state of California continues to enact new laws that require streamlined approval of housing projects by establishing ministerial approval processes for certain types of multifamily housing projects, as well as single family, accessory dwelling units, and the future SB 9 units. Included in the required ministerial review process for such projects is the use of objective design standards rather than subjective standards. So to develop our objective design standards, the city contracted with Metropolitan Planning Group in March of this year to develop such standards. This process included a community forum that was held in June, work with the City Council Ad Hoc Committee for the objective design standards, and a joint study session that was held in October with the City Council and the Site and Architectural Commission. The proposed objective design standards will be supplementary to the existing city design guidelines, and the objective design standards will be applicable to all projects, but they will be the sole design standards for projects where state law prohibits the use of any subjective standard. The proposed objective standards address issues of privacy, landscaping, scale, quality of materials, and architectural elements. And staff recommends that the Site and Architectural Commissioners recommend that the City Council adopt a resolution to incorporate the proposed objective design standards into the city's design guidelines. Our consultant is here tonight for any other questions that might come up. And this concludes the staff report. I'd be happy to answer any questions also.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Ms. Perkins. Any questions for Ms. Perkins, commissioners?
I have a question slash, oh, do we do public comment first?
Well, yeah, we're going to get to that, but I also, I don't know if the consultant wants to, I think it's Mr. Ford here tonight, if he wants to provide any sort of additional introduction to what has been prepared and delivered to us for review. If so, use the raise hand feature. I'll know to call on you. Oh yeah, it looks like you're on. Great. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Well, how are you?
Good. I think I'm still waiting for permission to share my screen. Oh, join as panelist, okay. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, can you see my screen?
We can. Thank you.
So I just have a real brief presentation about 9 or 10 slides. And I've been here, one of my colleagues is with me, Aaron Tao. We've been here since 7, so that was interesting to hear the whole discussion about SB 9, particularly when you were talking about one of the standards, C.2.2, regarding a minimum size for a porch. So what I'm just going to cover real briefly is just remind you why we're doing this, and you just had a great hour-plus discussion of why this is important. Remind you what the timeline is, which Diana kind of just went over, and she also discussed the community engagement. And then I just want to point out how we came up with that document. What were the key issues that really pointed us at what we put in it and what we were unable to put in it in some cases. So as we've been discussing, the whole point of the objective standards is that right now, before many of these housing regulations came online, you've been going through a discretionary review process. You've relied as much as you wanted to or needed to on the residential design guidelines that the town adopted some number of years ago. And that allows you to go through the Site and Architecture Commission and the City Council and have a discussion about whether a project makes sense. Now we're getting to a point where that discretionary review, as you've been discussing, is going away, and there's going to be a significant number of potential applicants that are going to come forward with a project that will require only ministerial review. So that's the primary objective of our objective standards. Tonight, we're here with the little orange box. The last time I talked to you, we were back here at the joint study session. What we brought to the joint study session were the first sort of glimmerings of ideas of what we were putting together. And then after that meeting, we went through a couple of drafts. We developed an admin draft, an administrative draft of the objective design standards. That went to staff, Diana and Sergio, and they gave us comments. And then we replied to those comments and created what's the public review draft, with the draft that's been out on the street, I believe, since last Friday. Shortly before we published the public review draft, we got a couple of comments from staff that sprung out of your joint, I think it was a joint study session regarding specifically SB 9 that was 2 weeks ago. So that's all in the public review draft. What we want to do tonight is allow you to have a discussion, take public comment on the public review draft, and then similar to the way you crafted it's not an ordinance, but your approval with caveats for the council, we'll take that with the draft to the council and ask them to consider it for adoption. So as Diana mentioned, there's a project website. It wasn't heavily trafficked, if you will. I think we only ended up, we asked people if they wanted to please give us their email addresses. I think we ended up with less than 15. Less than 12. There was a little online poll that we were trying to elicit information from people about what was the right kind of house that they would like to see in the flats on the hillside with landscaping. There was the community forum. A number of the issues that found their way to the objective standards started to surface in that community forum. There was also a city council ad hoc committee that we met with in August to sort of, we surfaced some ideas in advance of the joint study session and got some feedback from them. So some of the things, the ad hoc committee was great. They came prepared with their version of how to amend the subjective design guidelines. I think I've mentioned it in other meetings with folks, but as good as it still wasn't really completely objective. So you get something like, you get something like greatest extent feasible. That's still not going to work. You can argue about that. And the whole point of the objective standards is there's no arguments. It's clear what is allowed and what is not allowed. So there's a series of things. And as you might be able to tell, a lot of this is starting to get towards privacy, adjacencies and things like that. So as it turns out, that's really some of the issues that we really started grappling with. So we started with your residential design guidelines. I think in your staff report, you received a little matrix that showed where we were able to take a residential design guideline and either develop an objective standard or not. And if we were not, we generally, I think we gave a reason in all of them. So there's a whole series of reasons that didn't happen. Maintain neighborhood character. That's really hard to objectify. So we tried where we could. We addressed things like architectural facades and how they might be elaborated on, how the landscaping might be helped. Guidelines relating to setbacks, height, lot coverage. You discussed that a lot just a little while ago regarding the SB9 lots. Those are already addressed in the city's zoning code. Specific details such as eaves and spark arresters. We are trying to refrain from things that had to specify an exact architectural detail that might not apply to an entire zoning district. Views, they're hard to objectify because they're so place specific. It's actually a lot easier if the community has a view protection ordinance or something like that. And then outdoor areas, you will see that we did a number of things about outdoor space, but it's really hard to regulate things when sun and shade patterns are going to be changing. So what this boiled down to, the real key issues that we tried to address in the objective standards were privacy, particularly at the upper floor level. We had some community members come to the forum and speak about issues such as, you know, an existing house, and then somebody comes in with either a new project or remodel next door, and suddenly there's a second floor balcony, and maybe there's new windows on the second floor that look right into another space. So we tried to grapple with those issues. And then interesting high quality architecture. We tried to develop some either specific standards or menus of options where people might assemble a series of things that get to a certain number of points, and then they pass the standard. It's interesting, just as a sidelight, the whole that C.2.2 regarding the minimum size on the porch, it was really written before there was an SB9. It was written to answer this second orange bullet point. How do we create something that makes the facade more interesting than just a flat surface? I think it was started getting response the night after, or the morning after I first spoke with you, this group. One of you wrote me an email talking about how it would be great if we could try to find ways to, you know, make a more nuanced architecture so that they weren't just white, you know, flat buildings. And so the interesting thing about your discussion is we wrote the standard to impose a minimum size on a porch because we were thinking of it as an architectural feature. And I think your discussion was thinking about the porch in a different way. So it was kind of interesting, and we should make sure that that's covered the way you need it to be covered. With regard to that privacy issue, we did I'm just pointing out a couple of standards. B 1.2 regards landscaping. And what we tried to do is say if someone comes in and wants to put some significant outdoor area that that faces onto an adjacent property, that there's a minimum amount of landscape screening they have to do, and then it has to be 6 feet in height. That's a way of just creating a screen or a buffer between that outdoor area and the adjacent parcel. Again, this was written before SB9 came along with a 4 foot you know, maximum setback, side setback. The other issue is C 1.3, which is illustrated to the left, leaving the minimum setback as it is for the ground floor, you know, and that the minimum side setback is different in each of your 3 residential zones, but that is what it is. But when you get onto the upper floor, we throw a 45-degree line, imaginary line from the property line, and that provides a distance that the upper floor can't conflict with. So that was just one way that we've done a lot. What we're looking at, this type of regulation has been used for a number of years, particularly in places like all up and down the peninsula. If you think about El Camino Real, where it's a commercial frontage, and then immediately behind you have single family neighborhoods in many of those towns up and down. So they've used this a lot to try to provide daylight and separation for those adjacent parcels. And there's different ways of doing it where you actually throw this line, but that's basically where we got it. And then a plan view of just looking at, for instance, an existing building on the left, and somebody comes in with a new building, imposing some minimum offset distances for upper level windows or porches. And here we're saying, let's say if the buildings are any closer than 20 feet, this standard would be kicked into place, where there has to be a minimum of 8-foot distance between the center line of this window and the center line of this window. And the way we came up with the 8 feet is we looked at a typical upper floor window, what it dimension might be, and then dividing it in half, finding the center line, and trying to make sure that there was just no direct view in on upper floors, particularly when buildings got close. This is modeled on an objective standard that we found in the Santa Barbara objective standards. They allow much closer distance for their buildings, even in the really nice architectural districts of the city, but they start to play with that offset issue. So we developed that into a standard for you folks. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we heard from Diana after your SB9 study session that there were a couple of issues that came up. We had already had a standard in there in our document, our draft document, regarding roof mounted mechanical equipment and such. And we made a new standard to make sure that that was also, the screening component was covered for anything that was on the ground level as well. And then also the exposed stairways, trying to find a way that they not be, that they just don't happen. So we wrote a standard that they had to be within the building envelope. So they had to be enclosed to some degree, whether you come in one joint door, there's a unit on the ground floor and a stairway to the top, or if it's an exterior stairway, it's still behind the facade of the building. And with that, as the staff report requests, we're looking to see if you can recommend or adopt a resolution to the city council that they consider and adopt a resolution to adopt these design guidelines. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Commissioners, do you have any questions for Mr. Ford or?
I do.
I do, yeah.
All right. Sorry,
So-
Tom, you have some questions. Go start, Heather.
Our city is made up of, several different zoning districts, and I'm more concerned with 1.3, the 2-story 45-degree angle. I actually do this for a living. I've never seen it done this way. So my house, for instance, is a 63-foot lot. My setback is 6 feet. And so I would have to, if I went to the max height that my second story could be, which is 30 feet, I'd have 3 feet I would be allowed to go to that max height. I couldn't have a 2-story. My house doesn't conform in any way to the standards of this for the R18s. And I have a very modest house, and I'm set back, I think 12 feet on one side, and I'm 6 + 9, 15 on the other, and my house wouldn't conform in any way. And my house is only 25 feet tall. So I was concerned. Most cities do a daylight plane very differently than this. You come in the amount of the setback, so 6 feet would be my setback. You go up like 10 or 11 feet, and then you draw the 45-degree line for the second story. And that's how it's a typical daylight plane would be defined. So that was my big concern, was that. And then I wondered if we could come up with a way to just allow no exposed stairs going to second stories, that they all have to be internal.
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, please.
That's a great point about that the 45-degree could make your lot undevelopable. So we can look at that longer or in more detail. I have seen that the 45-degree line, for instance, in Redwood City's downtown, they don't throw the 45-degree until they're 15 feet off the ground, and then they throw it over. What was the second point?
It was more about and then I also forgot, I had one more point too, the looking into the neighbors' windows. If you look, I'm like in the Poppy Bruce Vista area, I'm on Poppy. Our little neighborhood almost every single house in this neighborhood would be non-conforming under this, and also the 8-foot rule for looking into people's windows. I have a second story house next to me. I have a second story. We put window coverings in our windows to obscure privacy, but their house is built right up to the setback on their side. I'm in 12 feet. And I can look into their house if they didn't have window treatments, but it's just so confining on these smaller lots where you can arrange your rooms and windows. I also had issue too with the 42-inch sill height for second story windows. All my windows wouldn't conform either. And they're not, I mean, I don't think it would be unreasonable to go down to like a 36-inch level. I just don't think that's a legitimate point, because it can all be addressed with window treatments and landscape screening. So, but the bigger point was the daylight plane would pretty much make every house in the R18 not conforming. For instance, at the 6 foot, another way to explain it to the commission. So at the 6 foot setback, my house could only be, oh, I guess it's a second story. So I mean, it would basically, I would have 3 feet. I could go to the full second story height on my house in the middle of my lot.
Right. So with regard to the windows, we weren't trying to make people non-conforming. We were trying to just write a standard for new construction. So, but we don't have to put that standard in there. But I would argue that it's still reasonable for new construction to not align their windows with the existing building next door.
But let me ask a question, because I was looking at the same thing that Heather was, and I don't know how other than the fact that both windows are not aligned directly across from one another, how is that providing any level of privacy? Because you have one that's peering down on another. So I mean, in a residential setting, I don't know that really does a lot. I mean, are there other ways that cities have addressed this that we're not looking at?
Just now, I'm bringing my screen back. So you're talking about this, Mr. Booker?
No, I'm talking about the residential building center line for the upper floor windows.
Page 8.
Yeah. 2.6.
Right. Are you guys seeing my screen?
Yep.
This is 2.6. Well, like I said, I mean, we've seen this in other communities. This is a plan view. I want to make sure that you realize this is a plan view. You're not looking down, you're looking across. So we just did this as a way to try to offset those upper floor views and create some privacy. If it's not reading as a plan, that's a big deal. We can
yeah, no, I guess I'm looking at it as if you have two separate buildings there, and then you've got a center line of the property, and one's higher than the other, correct? I mean, you've got your center lines that are separated by an 8-foot length.
Yeah, across the property line. So it's two
Across
parcels
the
side by
property
side.
lines, exactly. So
Right.
to me, it looks like you do have clear visibility into the property next door. Now, am I not reading that correctly?
No,
or-
I think you're right. I mean, you can still have some, but at least it's not direct.
Okay. Well, that was my point at the beginning. Yeah, so it's not direct, you're right, but I mean, it still doesn't lend itself to a huge amount of privacy. I don't know. I'm wondering if there are other ways that it has been addressed when you have in a residential setting like this. That's all.
Landscape screening. That's what between us and our neighbors, there's a landscape screening to give us privacy.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, or window treatments as someone mentioned.
Right.
But we can't impose interior window treatments in the objective standards. Well, I'm happy to either drop it or expand the distance between the minimum clearance, or find some other, if it's still an important issue. Like I said, the privacy issues seem to be the thing that came from the earliest meetings, that people wanted that. To some way, even though they're neighbors and it's a single family neighborhood, and you're going to have a next door neighbor on one or two sides, is there ways to increase privacy?
What I've seen in some other jurisdictions is just they just call out staggering it, not necessarily calling out by how much.
Right. And the problem with staggering is the applicant and the planning staff could have different ideas of what's staggering. So we were just trying to give a metric so that there's no way to argue about it.
And I'll agree with Mr. Ford that that would be a problem unless we have some sort of defined metric.
And what about window height? I think it was mentioned earlier where if a window were placed in a position on the wall at a higher level from the floor, that where you wouldn't have, I guess you would be able to realize that there would be light from the window, but not give you a clear, visibility down into or across from. I'm just thinking of different ways that it might be addressed, but.
So can I just make a comment on that? So at 42 inches is what's written in here right now. 42 inches, your line of sight is, depending upon how tall you are, is above 42 inches. So I don't see how it makes a difference in looking into somebody else's house with having the minimum window height of 42.
Oh, it is 42 inches.
Yes,
Okay.
in the document.
Right. This is generally a dimension that's used in a lot of design guidelines that have been trying for years to deal with this issue, but they're subjective and they're not enforced. So that's where we got the 42. You're right. Well, most kids can't look in over 42, but once it gets beyond 42, it's not really a window anymore. It's a clear story. So at some point you have to like decide what you want to do. We are saying that it's only required if that wall is within 15 feet of a side or rear parcel line. So that's, by Monte Sereno standards, fairly close, a fairly close setback. Like I said, Santa Barbara has a much smaller setback and they impose some of these rules, particularly the window placement rule. So again, I mean, we can either amend it to be less than 42, but or amend the 15-foot distance to the parcel line or such. But again, what we're trying to show is that when new construction comes in and that existing home is already on the other side of the property line, what are some things that we can do to increase privacy for that existing home?
Mm-hmm.
On the same vein as privacy in the standards themselves, the only provisions for balconies has been that it won't encroach into the parcel setback. But at least what we've seen is we've had neighbors come in to the commission and can actually object to construction of balconies or requiring that there be privacy hedging, etc., that would be installed. So is there something in the objective standards that we can add either to prevent balconies or require that there be like the commission, or is this, or do we not have any jurisdiction to that?
You were breaking up a little bit, but I think I got what you were saying, is wondering if someone builds a second floor balcony, can we impose a greater landscape screening requirement that they might have to, we can do that. I mean, we can try to write something like that and I can run it past staff. I'm not sure if there would be enforcement problems, but I think we can do it. I'm actually on my other screen, I'm scrolling through to see if we've already dealt with that in a way.
Mr. Ford, I feel like it would be better for this document to be divided into the different zoning areas in our town. So R18, R120, R144, because they're such very different areas. And it doesn't seem like the one size all approach to some of these issues work very well. Again, I'm worried about the R18 more than I think it would work. A lot of these things work great for the bigger lots, but for the smaller lots, not so much.
Okay. It could also be that we leave the document as it is, but for specific guidelines, if there are specific standards, if they're not going to apply to one of those zoning districts, we just state it right there in that standard.
That works.
All right, guys, let's do this. I want to be efficient tonight with everybody's time, including those in the public that want to comment. I think, Mr. Ford, you're going to be sticking around for a while answering questions of commissioners. But initially, I just had an opportunity for you to answer questions of the commissioners, and we'll circle back to you. But let's move to the public comments so folks aren't sitting around all night. And we'll circle back to you, and I appreciate your patience while we do that.
Sure.
So those of you from the public who've had an opportunity to review the proposed objective standards, this is your opportunity to chime in and let the commission and Mr. Ford and all of us know how you feel about these things. And everybody gets 3 minutes as we ordinarily do, and we use the raise hand feature in this Zoom world that we live in. And I know to call on you then. Does anybody want to speak from the public on the proposed objective standards that we're reviewing tonight? All right, I see no, Mr. Jeans, great. Mr. Jeans, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'm here, so I thought I would comment. First of all, I'm going to spend 30 seconds on your previous item. I know I shouldn't, but I will. So notwithstanding Justin and me, I'm disappointed that you didn't make any recommendations over changing it from 800 feet. That's unfortunate. Also, pi is 3.414, so the diameter of a 36-inch tree translated into circumference is 123 inches, which should be rounded up to 125. You may want to change that. Porches, I think restricting them to 18% is a little small. I would go with, if you're going to put a number on it, 25%. If you had an 800 square foot building, that would be the equivalent of a one-car garage, 200 square feet. And I was disappointed that there were no comments on street frontage access, which I think should be changed in that plan. As to the impervious coverage, as you go from, as you go down, I'm okay with that. But I think it could have been left alone. I think from 13,000 to 2 R120 lots would make 16,000, which is not particularly onerous, especially as there is a requirement not to have any runoff increase. So I'm going to skip now to the document itself that we're reviewing. On page 3, what if the driveway is at the edge? How does the vision triangle work? I think on page 4, height and scale, I think that is not a clever way of wording 1.2. I think you want something like no more than 50% of the upper floor facade length shall not exceed 50% of the ground floor facade unless it steps back a minimum of 6 feet. For example, what if there is no what if only the right-hand end sticks out and the left doesn't? I think you've got to do a ratio of upper floor facade to downstairs. I agree with the plane is wrong. It should be left as it is in the code now, which is setback, go into the setback and then start your 45-degree angle. And the last couple of things I had were, I disagree with the 42-inch window item. That only gives you one place to put an egress window because the opening cannot be lower than 44 inches. So you're stuck with a window. I don't think it buys you anything. If it's a privacy issue, make them screen it with frosted glass. The setback thing is similar. I think it should be, the offset windows is similar. I think it should really be setback dependent, which is another way, a similar way of looking at is zoning district by zoning district. But if you can make it setback dependent, then you don't have to define it for each zoning district. Those were the comments that I had. I thought the overall document was very well done. And I'm just throwing out comments because I had a chance to read it while you guys were talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jeans. Anybody else from the public that wants to speak to the proposed objective standards that the commission is considering tonight? All right, seeing none, I'm going to close the public comment portion of this second item on our agenda this evening and circle back to the commission and Mr. Ford for additional questions and comments in relationship to the proposed document or draft document that we have before us tonight. Commissioners, I know, Heather, you had a couple of things that you addressed with Mr. Ford and Patrick as well. Are there others that you have or other commissioners have that they want to address tonight?
I have a few.
All righty, go ahead, Allison.
Okay, so in the landscaping section on page 1, the in 1B.1.2, you say that where there's a sport court, pool deck, or balcony, etc., that basically you require landscape screening and trellises, which shall be a minimum of 6 feet in height. I wondered if you want to put the mature height of the landscape screening should be minimum 6 feet, because that's a pretty tall, I mean, something that's ultimately 8 or 10 feet, you probably wouldn't buy it from the nursery 6 feet tall already. So do you want to put mature height perhaps? Mr. Ford, you're muted.
Sure, that sounds great. The only thing that I would caution you is, then somebody says, well, when it's mature, it'll be 6 feet, but you just have to wait 8 years. So at some point you want to increase, you want to have some, the day it's planted, you want to have some minimum, I think. Maybe 6 feet is too much, but.
For like Pittosporum, they're normally not 6 feet right out of the gate. They're usually 4 feet tall, even if they'll be appropriate size. And then we need to be clear. I don't know what the right standard is, but right now it's ambiguous.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Anybody else have others?
Yeah, I also, so, and then turning the page to B 1.3, it talks about basically separating ground floor outdoor spaces with one of the following landscape elements, and it lists A, hedges, B, flower beds, C, shrubs, or D, a fence or low wall. And my preference would be for hedges or shrubs, and possibly omitting flower beds and fences, because most of the flower beds I see are empty. They're just brick with dirt in them. People often don't maintain them, where a hedge can be quite low maintenance. And then a fence, fences usually aren't as aesthetic as plants. And the same is true for low walls. That's just my opinion on that. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Well, I agree with the flower beds. As I think I've told you before, I think you've been to my house, so you know that's true. No, I think those are very good comments as well. Anybody disagree?
Oh,
Okay, and then moving down to B2, fencing and walls. 2.2 says automobile gates and pedestrian entry gates shall incorporate the materials and colors utilized by the primary residential structure. I like the spirit of any posts matching the house and such, but the actual gate, many gates are wrought iron or something similar. So you won't necessarily have wrought iron on the house, even if the gate's quite lovely, made of metal. So I think we have to somehow address that you will have fences that aren't the same material as the house, but are perfectly lovely.
Well, is there anything wrong with the way I read this too? Like, again, R18, like a pedestrian gate would just be a gate that would match your fence, in my opinion, in my neighborhood per se. Are we saying that we have to upgrade pedestrian or automobile gates? I have both. Both of mine are made out of fencing materials that match my fence. So are we saying we're not going to allow that because it's not the same as my primary residence?
I think that's how I'm interpreting it now that I read it again. And you're absolutely right, Allison, because yeah, we have a small gate that's wrought iron, does not match the fence.
So, I mean, if we're trying to avoid chain link fences, can we just say no chain link fences, or what's kind of the goal there?
Well, the goal is not to try to rewrite your fence ordinance, because I know you folks just did that. So, and I think chain link fence are not allowed. But what we were really trying to do here is be objective. And we were trying to get away where you didn't have a French Tudor house and suddenly you have a Spanish mission gate. So we were trying, but you can't write an objective standard that says match the house, because match is interpreted differently by different people. So that's why we referenced the materials and colors utilized by the primary residence. It sounds like, what about if we added the residence or fence? Because sometimes the fence will be a little bit different of a material than the materials and style of the home.
I suppose.
I completely understand why you brought this up. But we almost dropped it, but we wanted to keep it just to have something and get to something that, a significant automobile gate. Maybe it's two. Maybe we should break this into two. An automobile gate, which is a substantial structure, needs to match or use the colors and materials used in the structure. But a pedestrian gate would be different. It should match the materials and color used in the fence that it's part of.
Is there no way to just simply say match this, like the style of the residence? Because again, we don't have a wrought iron fence, but we have a wrought iron small gate that leads into our backyard.
Right. Without establishing standards for what all of the different architectural styles might be in the city. That would be hard to do, because you're using that word match, and the city planner might have a different idea of match than the applicant. So we're trying to get away from using the words match, the words consistent with, and just say, look, whatever materials and colors are used in that structure, you've got to use them here.
I frankly can't imagine someone going out of their way to pay to build a gate or fence that clashes horribly with their house. I mean, why? Yeah.
I agree.
And I can't imagine anybody who's going to utilize a lot of wrought iron in their house either. So but you see wrought iron gates.
Yeah, one of the big issues is as we're drafting, potential revisions to this that we should be keeping in mind is the way that the statutes define what is objective. And the definition in SB 330 of objective means that it involves no personal or subjective judgment by a public official, and it's capable of being uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable by both the development applicant and the public official. So basically, it has to be something that we can put down in writing that is clear at the time that the applicant files their application, whether or not they're going to be in compliance.
Okay, but then going back to what Commissioner Zeidler was saying earlier, can we just write what it can be made out of? Like, instead of just trying to somehow make it match or incorporate the materials and colors
Yes.
utilized?
Yeah, that would be okay, I think. If you say these are the permitted materials that you're allowed to use, that's fine. But ultimately, whether or not that addresses the concerns about matching, a fence or matching the primary dwelling, that's a different issue as well to keep in mind.
To give another example, our neighbors have like a modern farmhouse. It's not white, it's cream, but they put in a split rail fence. So that raw wood isn't on their house at all, just the fence, but it is a consistent style. So the materials standard wouldn't really work, even though the fence style wise is consistent. I think really we're just trying to avoid chain link fences and kind of, hurricane type, I think it'd be better to just say what we don't want.
Sure. So
I agree.
maybe just change this to be a list of prohibited materials. Unless we find that you've already written that in your fence ordinance, but perhaps not.
Well, I think that'd be great. Look at the fence ordinance, and if there's stuff already in it you can use, incorporate it or
Well, if it's in the fence ordinance, we'll probably just drop this because you already have your fence ordinance.
See, I vote for dropping it. I don't think it's an issue.
I agree.
Well, we do have concerns about, and we have reviewed and been concerned about fences that make a home look like a compound where it's all enclosed. And so I want to make sure that we address that in the objective standards, because that look is not something that we've ordinarily been receptive to.
So no high stucco walls. And actually this standard would not be good for that, because if your house is stucco, you don't want a high stucco fence. So I think that as drafted, it just does not work.
Yeah.
Well, I think the fence in your ordinance is already capped at, I think it's 6 feet, and then you have an additional foot that you're allowed of trellis type material.
Lattice, yeah.
Mr. Ford, could you just look at the existing ordinance and see if there are any subjective bits that we need to drop, or if we need to tighten up the objective parts? Just use that maybe as the starting point and make suggested improvements to it.
Sure, we can do that.
Well, I have a couple questions for Sergio. Sorry, Sergio. The first question is, we need to deliver something tonight so that come January 1, should an SB 9 project be application be submitted, that there are objective standards for planning to review that, correct?
Yes, but so I will say that the SB 9 ordinance includes a number of already significant objective limitations with respect to building size limit, with respect to coverage, additionally with respect to the items that we discussed earlier tonight, prohibition on rooftop decks, prohibition on second-story balconies. We're already going to be imposing limits on permitted exterior covered spaces. So there will be, even if these particular standards are not the design standards are not adopted, there'll be some objective limitations in place come January 1st for SB9 projects. That being said, these additional design requirements, if they're not prepared and the commission isn't ready to make recommendations on them this evening, those would not be in effect come January 1st. So there wouldn't be design requirements for SB9 projects necessarily.
Understood.
At least not as comprehensive as are being discussed this evening.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question relates to what effect adoption of these objective standards ultimately will have on existing structures. Do they become non-conforming in some sense then, so that if somebody comes forward with a remodel request, what effect does non-conforming features of that existing structure have on their ability to make additional remodeling efforts?
So that is a tricky question. Because this is being adopted as an addendum into the city's design guidelines. Basically, projects that are subject to a site development permit, you would need to determine that the project, and let me just take a look at our current site development language. For the projects that are subject to a site development permit, you still need to make the required findings that they're overall compliant with the, design guidelines, including any requirements in the addendum. That would be how ultimately the enforcement hook for this. So I don't think necessarily that if you have some features that are in the existing building that it would make it legally non-conforming, because as long as the addition increases the conformance of the property, and as long as you determine that you can make the findings to approve a site development permit, I think that likely you could still approve a site development permit for an addition on an existing structure.
That has features that are non-conforming so long as the additions do conform.
Yes, I think that would be ultimately how this would work in practice.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you.
Sergio, where we're talking about SB9 projects and then non-SB9 projects, it says that, the objective design standards will be supplementary. I think we need something that says, should there be a conflict between the proposed objective design standards and the existing design guidelines, that for non-ministerial projects, we retain the discretion under the design guidelines, because the design guidelines are much more nuanced. And I don't want applicants to be arguing that sort of the minimal requirements under these objective design standards are all they need to abide by on all projects. I understand that we need the standards for the SB9 projects, but I'm not ready to make this be the governing design guidelines basically for everything.
And I think that is the intention of making this an addendum rather than making this the replacement to the design guidelines. So the wrinkle and the reason why we're doing it as an addendum is because SB 330 says that effective January 2020, so beginning of this year, no city in California can pass any new design requirements whatsoever that are subjective. So any new requirements that you have to be objective. It doesn't require that a local jurisdiction stop enforcing any subjective requirements that it has. It can't just make new ones. So with respect to, the findings that the commission makes with site development permits, one of the findings is whether the proposed improvements, including architecture, are consistent with the city's design guidelines. So I think the way that you would ultimately interpret this and apply this in practice is, you can determine a project is not consistent with the design guidelines when it fails to meet the objective standards. However, you still, at least for projects that are subject to discretionary review, you would be looking at the design guidelines as a whole document, including the addendum that's objective and all of your prior design guidelines. And that was why we wanted to add this as an addendum, so you're not getting rid of the existing ones for projects still subject to discretionary review.
Okay, well, I'll give you an example. There's a tree guideline in here about trees, one tree per so many square feet. I can't remember where it is now, but to make it an objective standard. But we want to be able to specify sometimes the type of tree or what may be taken out or what may not. I'm afraid we'll have an applicant saying, I'm meeting the, one tree per so many square feet standard, and you can't require more of me, or you can't require it be evergreen or deciduous or native or whatnot. I think we really need at least one provision about where there's a conflict or the fact that the objective design guidelines don't extinguish any of the other design guidelines for non-ministerial projects. I think it'll be confusing if we're silent as to where there's conflict, where we have two provisions on the same subject.
Got it. That makes sense to me. I think really the issue that you are highlighting, I think, can be addressed in an introductory paragraph to this addendum, stating that these requirements are the minimum objective standards for projects with ministerial approval. However, applicants particularly for projects that are subject to discretionary approval still have to comply with all applicable requirements in the entire design guideline document. So, okay. I think that will be easy to add when this comes back to my desk.
I like that. That's good. Anybody else have anything for Mr. Ford or Mr. Rudin or Ms. Perkins?
I still have a couple of little things.
I'm sorry, Allison.
You asked.
No, you've been awesome tonight. They're all very quality items.
Thank you. On window frames and such, it says it's in 2.4. I don't know if it's C 2.4. It's on page 7. It says the window frames, mullions, and muntins, or however you say that, shall be constructed of wood, steel, or aluminum clad wood. We were looking at getting some replacement windows, and they had some sort of wood composite that lasted longer. Sometimes a little bit of technology actually improves the quality of the window. So I don't know all the window types on the market, but I don't know that we want to prohibit some sort of composite.
I agree with you, Allison. Anderson makes a fiberglass composite window that you wouldn't know the difference between that and a aluminum clad window, and it holds up really well. So yeah. I would agree with you on that.
Maybe similar to our fence discussion, we write what the materials are that are prohibited. So for instance, what this is really trying to do is saying no vinyl windows.
Yeah, just say that. That would be probably easier.
Vinyl and aluminum, or just?
Aluminum windows, though, can be really expensive and nice. There's good aluminum and there's bad aluminum. So I don't think we should prohibit aluminum per se.
Okay.
Like Fleetwood windows that are really expensive are aluminum.
Okay, and then on page 9, when it's talking about materials, exterior building materials, I don't know what letter that is, but it's section 3.1. Says the exterior of the building shall include at least 2 of the following materials: wood, stone, slate, zinc, etc. I saw a provision in someone else's code that said percentages. So it said, maybe you have to have at least 20% of 2 different building materials or something like that. Otherwise, you could literally have just some minimal screw or decor item and meet that standard.
So, okay,
I think you need some percentages.
okay, I understand.
I mean, you could literally have one zinc screw and meet that standard. And I saw it in someone else's code. It might have been Los Altos, but I'm not positive. And then going backwards, sorry, it's not in order, but on page 2, under the provision about hedges and shrubs and such, you have section 1.4. It's probably, yeah, B.1.4. Says outdoor open areas are required for all residential development and will include a private area accessible to each unit, etc. What does that mean?
It means if it's an upper floor, it might be a balcony, and if it's a ground floor, it needs to have like an outdoor area. It doesn't necessarily need to be roofed, like your discussion in the earlier item, but it's, you know, something that belongs to that unit. It's their private space.
I think we need to tighten that up if it's going to be an objective standard, because an outdoor open area could mean your whole backyard. I just don't think it means anything that particularly clear. So, I mean, do we say a space delineated by either a patio or a wall? Or I think we need to, if we want it to mean something, give more detail.
Okay, do you also mean perhaps like when we say outdoor open area, are we referring to a specific size? Because this is all we have defined right now. It's in our definitions. However, I was looking at a document today, I think it was Beaverton, Oregon, or South Lake Tahoe, where they actually specified, you know, a 20-foot by 20-foot square needed. This is just their document. They said the open area has to be big enough that a 20-foot by 20-foot square would fit in it. So there are ways to start to talk about these places that have very objective size to them, if that's also what you're getting at. Because we have defined it here, but it may not be enough of a definition for you.
Does anyone else have comments about that one? It just, I struggle with that provision.
I have a concern about where it is. I'm not a big fan of all of the outdoor open area being in the front of the home. It often ends up with people enclosing it with fences. So where it exists would be something I would like to see addressed in that. We have several properties in our community where people have expanded the fronts of their homes into usable space and enclosed them with fences, and probably appropriate where there's no other space. But in many instances, they have huge yards behind them, and it has that compound look that I think we all agree is not a good look. So I would want this to be amended in such a way as to deliver a location as well. Anything else, Allison?
Nope. Thanks for asking.
No problem. Anybody else? Because I have one. All right. So mine is, I think in the architectural elements, and I'm particularly focused on structures that are going to be created by virtue of SB 9, where we're going to have limited setbacks of 4 feet, that applicants make an effort to design the roof in such a way as to minimize the risk of glare from solar panels into adjoining structures. Do a lot of common interest development work, and there's always at least one case in our office where somebody's angry about the glare from somebody else's solar panels into their windows, and that those homes are all in close proximity to one another, and so too will be potentially SB 9 projects that have such a small setback. And so I know that what I'm suggesting has some ambiguity in it. And I'd like it to be as objective as possible, but the applicant should make some effort to design the roof in such a way so that it is not going to hold solar panels that will create glare in adjoining structures. Think that's workable, Tom, or no?
It's difficult. I'm pulling up the slideshow again. Let me, Diana tipped us off this afternoon that this is an issue that you might want to discuss tonight. So is my screen sharing still?
Yeah, we see it.
So my first Diana and I actually had a email conversation about this a little bit today. So because of the this California solar, I forget what it's called, the Solar Protection Act, it's really hard to limit. Well, you can't limit solar equipment. You can't prohibit anyone from having solar material on their home. So my thought was to get into it from a roof reflectance issue, like a roof can't reflect too much glare. And it's really hard to find anybody that's been able to objectively enforce that. But I did find this in South Lake Tahoe. The guidelines start out with all these beautiful colors and slate, pictures of example slate tiles and things like that. And then they move into the standard, the code. And both Diana and I don't think this is objective yet, even though they call it a standard. Non-glare, I think that's a debatable term, and minimize reflectivity is also debatable. But I think this is at least a start, and I think we can try to, continue to research that. This is only a couple hours this afternoon. There could be maybe something we haven't found yet, but I think it's going to be really difficult, particularly if it's tied to solar equipment.
Yeah, understood. And I know we can't impede the efficiency of those systems. Okay, thank you. All right, anything else, Commissioner?
Did you guys talk about designing the roof line? I mean, can't you have the panels kind of behind? Couldn't you have a roof that has a dip and they are behind the dip in the roof? Isn't there a way of designing a roof where you still get full solar panel sun exposure, but it's recessed from another part of the roof contour?
I'm not really following what you're saying, but it sounds like you're almost going to create something that would cast shade on it, which would make it ineffective.
Or, I mean, we have a structure that it looks like it's a tile roof, but really the tile is just around the edge and the center of the roof is flat. And if you put panels on the top of that flat roof, there wouldn't be glare. It's
like a parapet wall.
What's that?
Like a parapet wall. It's just a thin wall that has a recessed roof behind it.
Yeah, almost like a facade. If it's recessed enough, it wouldn't block sun to the panels, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be difficult. I can see that would be really difficult because you're imposing a very specific construction style of a roof upon everyone.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it because
I'll step back, I guess.
And also, see, I think the better way to try to attack it would be from just roof reflectance. But we can continue to look at it. I think the state of California is going to want to not do anything that would discourage a homeowner putting on a PV system. So if suddenly they have to have a very specific type of roof and parapet design before they can do it, that might be a little bit counterproductive.
Yeah, and I will say that with respect to building standards as a matter of uniform state law, the California Energy Code, which is part of the state building code that the city is mandated to enforce, has requirements with respect to prohibiting obstructions, including vents, chimneys, and architectural features and roof mounted equipment. in what's called the solar zone. Every single building in California either needs to include a photovoltaic system that meets certain requirements, or it needs to have a solar zone and be wired to be solar ready. And basically, most low-rise residential construction is required to have photovoltaic under the building standards code at this point. So that's an issue as well. We wouldn't want to create some sort of standard that conflicts with what the building code requires in order to build the building to begin with.
And I suppose any sort of setback would minimize the number of panels you could get, which they wouldn't want.
I don't know the answer to that, whether we can do that. To me, it seems like it's potential, but then on certain projects such as SB9, where you already have a small enough roof area because you are, limited to 800 square feet, and you still need to have a photovoltaic system that meets the formula in the energy code that generates enough annual electrical output equal or greater to the dwelling's electrical usage. I don't know how the math works out on that one, whether or not it's something that is practical.
Right.
I would
Tom, I
also
like
like
the
to
glare
add,
approach. If you could research the glare approach a little bit more, that may be the only way we create some sort of a protection for neighboring residents. All right. So if there are no other comments for Tom, then we have to make a decision tonight whether we adopt something we're not in love with, or whether we push this thing into another meeting at which we're going to review it and adopt it as an addendum, as Sergio advised. Any thoughts, commissioners?
I think we should push it.
Flavie, Allison?
Yeah, I don't think it's ready yet.
Can I make one more tiny little sentence comment on on page 10? It says build fences of non-reflective materials, use natural or dark colors. Natural materials should be used when possible. We have a lot of white picket fences in my neighborhood. Is that not allowed because it's white and reflective? Just asking if that's the direction we want to go with that.
Excuse me, I don't have a page 10. What was the actual number?
It's 10. It's when it goes into that spreadsheet with all the numbers. So it's
Oh,
Yeah.
7D8. Sorry.
okay, so that's a design guideline
Yeah.
in your document. And so we tried to address it in B 2.1. So let me go look and find.
So
B.
it's kind of what we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
We belabored that maybe already.
No, this is where we think we've dealt with it.
On B.
Yeah, what they suggested there is fencing shall be made of non-reflective materials or painted surfaces. They didn't put a standard about color.
Yeah, well, white would be reflective, just saying.
Well, non-reflective materials.
Okay.
So no gloss, no white gloss.
And there's gonna be the paint police.
Be mad.
Okay, enough said on that. We can move on. I don't think it's ever gonna be enforced on that, so.
All right, then we don't need to make any motion tonight, or do we, in relationship to this? Diana or Sergio?
I would say that if you're not prepared to approve, if you want to give direction to staff, I know there were a number of items that were discussed this evening, and I, for one, was not able to keep a comprehensive list. So I'm hoping Tom or Diana was able to do that. Otherwise, we'll have to go back through and look at the tape. But, to the extent that you guys want to make a coherent motion at this point about the things that you want staff to address, that would be useful for staff, I would assume.
Yeah, I didn't keep a good list in this instance either. Tom, do you think you've got enough feedback to address this?
Yeah, we, not only does I have cryptic notes, and then I have a colleague taking detailed notes.
Okay.
So
you,
we
Aaron.
know all of the issues that you brought up. My larger question is what we do with that. Do we do it now, or do we write a memo to the council that says, hey, the Site and Architecture Commission recommends that, 2.2 be changed to do this, what's our next step?
Well, so realistically, normally you would either make a recommendation to approve or you would make a recommendation not to approve. And in either case, we could take it to council and, have that discussion with council. Given the state of this evening's meeting, it sounds like, at this point, if you were to make a motion, it would end up being a recommendation not to approve, to do further revisions and then come back in January. So if that's the recommendation you would like to make to council, that would be what I would suggest. Certainly it would be pretty straightforward to go ahead and make those revisions and have another meeting in January, and then possibly have council adoption, of a revised version at the end of January. That
makes sense.
I think we should do that.
All right, I move that we not adopt the objective design standards presented to us tonight, and ask instead that Mr. Ford and his staff work on amendments and addendums as directed tonight, and that we review this matter in January, after which time we can make a recommendation to the city council.
I second that motion.
Ms. Perkins?
Commissioner Booker,
Yes.
Commissioner Harrington,
Yes.
Commissioner Sharma,
Yes.
Commissioner Zeidler,
Yes.
and Chair White.
Yes. All right. Anybody have any comments before?
Just thank you, Mr. Ford, for putting up with us. We really appreciate all your hard work, and I know this isn't easy, so.
No, we got to get it right. It's great.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank both you and Aaron, and thank you, Sergio, and thank you, Diana, for sticking around late tonight. We appreciate it. I know you guys are doing this often enough with the city council, but to have us do it to you is not nice. Any other comments from commissioners other than thanking everybody for tolerating us? All right, and Diana, do you have any additional report for us this evening?
I do not.
All right, with that, we'll adjourn. Everybody have a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you in January.
Or not.
Wait. I have one final comment. This is good for Heather. Heather did not decide to resubmit and join the commission, and so I want to thank her for her incredible service. How many times have you been on this commission, Heather?
4, so 8 years. So
Oh,
we'll see all of you 8 years from now and see where how you feel about everything.
The bad news for the remaining commissioners is that apparently the city council decided to renew my term. So I will be back in January, and we'll have one more additional commissioner take Heather's place. So Heather, we're going to miss you. You've been awesome. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to miss you guys, and thank you. You guys are all doing a fabulous job, and I feel like it's finally at a place where I can walk away and feel like we're in good hands. So thank you all for your time that you spend researching and volunteering and doing your jobs. I really
thank you.
Thank you.
Heather.
All
You
right.
gave so much up to your very last day.
Well, it didn't used to be like when I started out, it was so much different than it is now. And I won't talk anymore because I know you guys all want to check out and go, but it's changed a lot, and it's a lot more work and a lot more litigious and all of that compared to what it used to be. So it's a big commitment. So thank you for your service.
Oh, I'm looking forward to you stopping me down the street and telling me, what the hell were you guys thinking?
Thank you, Commissioner Harrington. I think this was great, like at least for my first year, having both you and Chairman White, just to sort of help guide with the process and how it all works. It really helped me. So thank you especially for, like teaching us the ways.
No, you guys have really done well, I think. So good job.
You're not going anywhere, are you?
I'm not going anywhere. No, I hope I stopped doing projects in Monte Sereno because it was too much of a conflict. I did a couple at the beginning and I'm like, this is just too weird. So maybe you'll see me presenting projects. Who knows?
That'll
Okay.
be fun. We'll like that. All right, everybody, again, thank you. Everyone have a wonderful holiday and I'll see you in the new year. Happy New Year, everyone.
Okay, see you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.